You're very familiar, Rob, with Volcker when he took over and had massive interest rate acceleration. Do you see parallels between now and then? Obviously, there's a bunch of differences, but where does your mind go when you think about past periods?
Okay, well, we'll talk about Paul Volcker, who I knew and greatly admired and worked with closely in many different contexts throughout my life. When Paul came in, it was similar today in one respect. The inflation that ignited, that was extinguished, say, starting in 1980, came from a supply shock in some significant part, which was the OPEC rise. I worked as an undergraduate for the famous oil economist Morris Edelman, and I remember when the University of Chicago was saying the Phillips curve is dead, and Morris Edelman and Bob Soler were saying, no, it isn't. It's just the production function has a second input or a third input besides capital and labor. It's called energy. And so the supply shock there is not unlike, it's not specifically the same, but it's a supply shock now like it was a supply shock then. I think the difference between that time and this time is very clear, which is coming out of the 60s, in the midst of the turmoil related to Vietnam and then problems in Iran, during, say, the Carter presidency, there was a lot of fear that the republic was spiraling out of control. But labor's share relative to capital's share was much higher, and unionization was much stronger. So as we talked about earlier, you can get an inflation jolt from a supply shock. The question is, does it become part of the ongoing dynamic of marking up wages, which marks up costs, and then the spiral continues? Volcker approached a world where labor's power and labor share was much higher than what Jay Powell is facing in the present time. And so I think there is some similarities, but I think invoking Paul Volcker as a hero and then going off super hawkish now is not paying attention to the subtleties that are very important about this situation. And by the way, Paul Volcker wasn't slamming the brakes on in the aftermath of quite such a big financial bubble as we've had since essentially 2010, since the
quantitative easing,
almost zero. Yeah, quantitative easing is a good way to put it. Yeah. So the other thing I would say, I don't know Jay Powell, so I can't comment there, but Paul Volcker was amazingly sensitive to all these different dimensions and aware. And number two, he wasn't a dogmatic economist who took out the kind of recipe book that INET was created to challenge. Paul Volcker was very subtle. And by the way, at the formation of INET, Paul Volcker was one of the donors. And then he built something called the Volcker Alliance, which was the last act in his life, and other people like the famous investor Ray Dalio and others supported him, which is we need to create a senior career, well-paid civil service that administers this market system with a depth of training and intellect and experience that Paul feared was not being, what you might call, promoted, where the best and the brightest weren't seeking roles in financial administration and regulation.